Well, I'm actually delighted to introduce to you today our guest speaker, Dr. Courtney McCluney. I first met Courtney about 6 or 7 years ago. Well, she was a postdoctoral student and she was working at the Darden School of Business, where I have a joint appointment, as well as over here with nursing. And among the projects that she worked on was some of the original mattering research with Julie Hazlett and Natalie May. So now she's like a legend around here. She then kind of grew up and took a tenure track position at Cornell University. But she will tell you, I have a sense, about her story, about how she decided to leave Cornell and start her own firm, which is called EquiWell Partners. And her work is really at the intersection of equity and wellness. And this has implications for us as individuals, the way we work with our patients, and also the way we work in organizations. I have some official language to share with you. Given the non-clinical nature of this series, financial disclosures are not required of the speakers or the planning committee. The content presented excludes discussion related to the products and services of commercial interest, and therefore lacks the opportunity for commercial bias to be introduced. With that said, I want to introduce Courtney again. She will be speaking on making room for rest and recovery in healthcare.
Thank you so much, Lily and Hannah, and so good to see Julie, Natalie, Jim, all of you. I'm so delighted to have met some of you, and for also there to be new folks here over at the School of Nursing. And I know that you all have been making a lot of progress around addressing all the many issues that we've experienced over the last 7 years. I think I started here back in 2017, which was again the beginning of having more explicit equity conversations, especially on Virginia's campus. But thinking about wellness and that piece being tied to ways that we address equity in life and in our workplaces has just become more and more apparent as we've continued to live through a pandemic and all the political turmoil that's happened since then, et cetera. So I think this is going to be a very generative conversation. I hope it'll be something that's useful to you too, to put into your practice in your classrooms and with your clinician work. So with that being said, let's get started with thinking about rest and recovery in healthcare. And I again came into this talk today. Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. So I came here with the Compassionate Care Initiative. So I started thinking a lot about compassion and how that really is the precursor and the beginning of providing care, where we first have to acknowledge that someone is suffering and then have a desire to alleviate that suffering in whatever capacity you can. And when I thought about this in terms of everyday life, we are existing at an age and a time where there is immense suffering that has kind of always been going on, but our awareness of it has just increased. And that is both the technological revolution, right? We have access to news from around the world 24/7, and that makes our awareness of suffering that much more palatable. And at the same time, it's created a lot of collective helplessness because the suffering is so great. Even if we have a desire to alleviate it, the belief in our power and capacity to do so is probably unrealistic and overwhelming. Like, how do we solve global crises? How do we solve deeply entrenched systems that create inequality? That's not something we can resolve in one day, in one afternoon, or even within one lifetime. And so feeling like you actually can address all the suffering that you are made aware of can contribute to feeling helpless and also lead to disassociation. And I have a psychology background. I am not a clinical psychologist, so do not take any of this as therapeutic advice. But when we feel that we lack the capacity to address the stress in our lives, that can contribute to things like burnout. And also when I say disassociation, that means a desire to not look at the issues that are going on. I can just pretend that it's not happening, tune it out, and that allows us to continue living. That's the evolutionary function of being a human, right? When there's something that exceeds my ability to address it, I can just ignore it and go on about my day. But what happens when there's collective disassociation, particularly at the societal level, at political levels, it leads to more suffering because we're actually not addressing the root causes of the suffering, right? And so we have this self-fulfilling prophecy going on where there's so much suffering, there's nothing I can do about it. And we as a collective do nothing about it. And so more suffering continues, right? So that creates a lot of compassion fatigue at a larger level. And collective disassociation will ultimately not address our desires as humans to live in a society where everyone feels cared for, everyone has dignity and love. So how can we do a better job of addressing the disassociation needs, the belief that we can't address all the suffering, but also not disconnect completely? And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how rest and recovery is both this individual practice, but also could become organizational and societal strategy. My belief on this is both related to looking at my child, but thinking about us as humans too. Typically, when we're overstressed, we just need a nap. Like babies really are our greatest teachers because they do the things they need to survive. When I'm cranky, I go to sleep. When I'm hungry, I eat. And if we can address those root causes, I think the world will be a much better place. So we're going to talk about how rest and recovery is related to this notion of having compassion at work, especially because I'm here with a compassionate care initiative. So how we address suffering and both notice it, but also feel like we have the capacity to address it is intimately related to our ability to rest and recover. So we can come back into our compassionate work. Rest and recovery is not, unfortunately, something that's universally shared. It takes quite a lot of privilege to be able to rest and to have time to recover. So we'll also talk about what inequities exist there. And then thinking about a rest and recovery strategy, one that you could put into place today as you're an individual with your lives, but also thinking and strategizing what would it look like in your classrooms? What would it look like in your units? What would it look like as a larger organizational collective? So we'll spend some time dreaming about that. And then we'll have, hopefully, time for questions and Q&A. I tend to talk a lot, so I'll try as much as possible to be mindful of time. Someone let me know when there's 10 minutes left if we haven't gotten to Q&A, and I'll speed along. Something that I have noticed when I give talks like this is it sounds nice. And it's like, no one has time for that. No one has time to hear about this very nice, touchy-feely, good stuff. But we can never reach a level or a existence that looks different and creates different experiences if we can't imagine it and see it for ourselves. So one of the things that I am going to invite you to do and ask you to do as you're sitting in this talk is to embrace the belief in possibility, to think about things from a perspective of it could happen, to really lean into your imagination, even if that's all it is for now. Like my unit would never do this, but imagine that they might. Dream of the possibility that you do have a magic wand. I'm a Harry Potter fan, I'm Slytherin. Imagine that you do have your wand and you can make things happen, right? Because it's only when we have presence, imagination, and hope that we can actually realize change. Those things are quite necessary to do it. And these are some of my favorite quotes around those things. Like we have to reimagine what's possible in order to make it come to light. So I invite you to embrace that. Again, children are our greatest teachers. They love imagining things. And so I'll ask you to go back to that childlike wonder and imagination as we go through this conversation around rest and recovery. Sounds good? Awesome. And this will be as engaging and I hope engaging as possible. So I will invite you to participate. I'm not going to do the cold calling that I used to do in my MBA classrooms, but I could. So no pressure. But I might just say, hey, you, what do you think? So try to avoid eye contact. Don't worry. Right. So suffering is part of healthcare. Right? People usually come into healthcare facilities. Sadly, they don't typically come on a regular basis just for routine checkups. They come when their suffering has gotten too great. Their pain management is too much. They're dealing with something that requires a lot more care and attention. And so when we think about the type of environments we want to live in creating more equity, especially in our healthcare environments, is hopefully a space where everyone has the opportunity to live their healthiest life possible. And it's not dependent on who we are, where we live, how much money we make. But we know, sadly, that that is not the reality for the world that we live in. Zip codes determine life expectancy, even when they're less than a mile apart. There is a street in Baltimore, Maryland, where the life expectancy goes down by almost 20 years on one street, just depending on which side of the tracks you live on. This is also intimately tied to race, to geographic location, whether you're in an urban dense area or a rural area. Poverty and class affects this. And not addressing these disparities that exist in our healthcare is very costly, both in terms of how much it's costing with the loss of labor, the loss of life that occurs when we're not addressing health issues, but also the extreme burnout that happens for providers who exist in spaces that are not well resourced to address all the myriad of health issues that are going on. So although healthcare is one of the primary systems we have in place to address suffering, it is also a space that disparities can become even more entrenched and aware. So why do you all think this is the case? Why has healthcare become this space where we don't have a lot of equity and where there is immense suffering that's disproportionately placed on certain groups of people?
Cost.
I'm sorry, Ms.
Cost.
Cost. Can you say a little bit more?
Cost.
Say a little bit more.
Cost.
I thought you didn't understand this. What sort, do you mean financial costs?
Yes.
What other costs? Yeah.
Just to go to see a primary care physician. Now, I'm fortunate, I do have health insurance, so I can readily go. But I think about someone, maybe perhaps a neighbor who does not have health insurance, or even if they work and cannot afford health insurance. That's health inequity for me, I think so.
Thank you so much for sharing. And health insurance is an imagination. Did you know that? All the things that we have in society was someone's imagination at one point and it became real. So when I say embrace imagination, I mean that. To this day, I'm a grown woman. I don't still fully understand insurance. It's so complicated. Why did we make it so complicated? And what does it mean to have health insurance? What does it mean to have health insurance tied to professions and work? That imagination, what does that mean in terms of sticking with a job you don't like? What does that mean in terms of feeling stuck, that I want to retire, I want to be able to enjoy the rest of my life, but I need this health insurance? That's an imagination that we could possibly reimagine differently, especially so things like costs don't create inequity in health.
Yes, and so I think that speaks to the systems in place and the people in the room and who's making the decisions and coming up with the possibilities. And so that imagination but potentially the employers who decided that, okay, we're gonna tie employment to your healthcare. And that was a way to get people to stay at that particular job, you know, at the inception. And so we think about who has the access and the ability to make the change. And that speaks volumes to this zip code in the discrepancy.
Absolutely. We're all living in someone else's imagination. And wouldn't it be great if the person who was making that imagination kind of knew a little bit about your life experience? And they didn't all have the same experience and assume everyone else is having the same experience. So we all should embrace this imagination of healthcare and how it's practiced. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, please.
I was thinking, I still see it today as lack of trust,
Mm-hmm.
you know, healthcare provider, system, culture, differences.
Yeah.
Even just getting a day off work today. Employment, so I see that.
Absolutely. Trust is a big one. And trust is something that is an unseen aspect of our life and our systems. And we're going to talk a little bit about compassion at different levels, both individual, but also interpersonal and structural. And they tend to mirror each other. People don't trust us because we don't trust ourselves, because we don't trust the system, right? And they're all interconnected. So it's like we start building deep trust within ourselves, which usually means you listen to yourself. When you're tired, how many of you just drink coffee and power through? That's not trusting your own body, right? Your body is telling you, go take a nap, go eat a real meal. But it's like, I can't, I have so many patients, I have to just eat this bar and drink this coffee and go. So we don't trust ourselves, and then we wonder why our patients don't trust us. Why should they? They see you burned out and tired, why would they trust that you have their best interests at heart? You don't even have your own best interests at heart. And then that becomes a system, right? That's constantly gaslighting itself. It's like, oh yeah, we care about our patients. Do you? Do you care about your staff? Do you care about each other? Right? It's like, how does what's happening at the individual level all of a sudden ratchet up to the whole system? I saw a hand here and then I'll go here. Yes.
I was gonna say it's all tied to communication, but not just verbally what you're hearing, but also your body language and things like that. So I think sometimes people are like, well, I said it nicely, but you didn't appear that way.
Yes.
So it's not just how you say it and the tone and stuff. You also have to remember what else they see
Yeah.
when they're looking at you.
That's a big one. Last one.
Right, money just drives everything, even down to when children have school days. The reason why school days are so long is to prep you, that way you're used to going to a place and staying all day and then going home at night. I mean, and as long as you're part of the corporate machine and the more money you make, the more taxes you pay, the more you can pay into society, the more products you can buy. So now that companies now own other companies and there's all this stuff, it's all about money. And drug companies, you don't see commercials for drugs in other countries. There's no need for it. But we pay, insulin was given. The person who invented insulin gave that away, but a company bought it to make money off of it. And it just makes me sick sometimes, sorry. But everything is all about money. Money drives everything. The minute your child starts kindergarten, they're becoming part of the system and part of the machine, and they're just meant to churn out products. They put toxins and stuff in our foods. That way we constantly need medication and things so that we can just barely hang on by a thread and keep on going.
We, so everything's connected. That's what, like, that's what a connection here. And the capitalism was an imagination, right? It was, what happened to people pay for drugs, right? It's like, what, instead of just giving it away. Taking a global perspective of things like healthcare is also fascinating. It can make you very angry. But I was reading recently about, there are laws regulating the type of advertisements you can have related to prescription drugs, but also even things like formula. The US does not regulate the formula industry's advertisements. And there is a disproportionate correlation between how many infant milk commercials you see and how less people are breastfeeding, right? And formula companies are actually lobbying against things like universal maternity leave, because if more women got to stay home from work, they wouldn't rely on so much formula, right? So there's this like interesting connection there. And the US is one of the few countries that doesn't regulate how much they put things in your face. Other countries do, because they realize there's an intimate connection between how much you're seeing a product and your likelihood to buy it.
You can see commercials at the gas pump now. I got
Yes,
TV.
that is so true.
Can't
And
get away.
And what we're all describing too, right, is like a system that, again, this imagination, it creates a sense of urgency. Everything's urgent, everything's important. It's a system that's very broken. I think going back to this idea that we are steeped in a capitalist society, that it even shows up in something like healthcare. Technology, the way that they encourage entrepreneurs to move in technology is you move fast and you break things. It's only by breaking things that you learn. But do we need to break people? Do we need to break human connection? Is that how we learn how to be better, more efficient providers? Is by breaking things really quickly and moving as fast as we can? And creating a system that's focused on efficiency and profit over care and people, it's not adequate. It's unable to address the myriad of issues that we have as a society that's already broken in so many ways. So what would it look like to move slow, to go deep instead of wide all the time, and to actually practice real compassion when we're not trying to move fast and break things? I want to get your hand and then we'll move on.
Well, one barrier that when you said technology, that sort of rang a bell, because there's a concept called techno stress. And it's a very real thing in terms of people being comfortable with going online, having to sign in for MyChart or, whatever access you have. I mean, that's a tremendous barrier for certain individuals, whether they're elderly or whatever, in terms of how do you navigate this computer stuff.
Yeah, I've never heard of that term, but it totally makes sense. And that's one of those technological innovations, right, that in some regards helps. But have we thought about it from an equity lens, from the beginning to end? Who's going to be using this, and what new stressors will that create? And have we created enough support to address those? And that is also related to things like compassion. Compassion is not just, did you touch your patient's hand and look at them? Is did we design a system that actually is helping to alleviate suffering, or are we just creating more suffering? Even if we're trying to do things like being very efficient and move fast. I'm an organizational scholar by training, and so I've read Monica Warline and Jane Dutton's book on awakening compassion at work, and they did study this a lot within healthcare, and there are 4 dimensions of how you have both this feeling and desire to enact behavior that alleviates suffering. Is that you first have to notice that suffering is happening, and then you have a desire to alleviate it. feeling some sort of empathy or perspective taking for those who are experiencing the suffering, and then taking the action itself. I could spend a whole hour on just these 4 points and talk about how bias creeps in here and how there's a lot of inequity between your ability to recognize pain in some folks. But that is not the focus of this conversation today. You have to bring me back, Lily, so we can talk about that, those things later. But these components of compassion are important because as you brought up with this great example of techno stress, it can emerge everywhere. It's not just on the bedside that we need to focus on compassion, but sadly, there is this over indexing of compassion only being disproportionately a nurse's job to do. And not other people in the healthcare setting. It's like this person's job is to save the patient's life. You have to be the one that's compassionate. Right? Like you're the one who like eases the information. I'll just do my other job. But how can we think about compassion as something that happens across all different spheres of the healthcare, everything from the mind chart that patients are using to the decor that's in the emergency room, right? And compassion is so important, as I mentioned at the top of the talk, because it helps us to have a desire to alleviate suffering as we see it happening all around us. And there are so many benefits to compassion too, which you probably all know, because I'm sure Hannah and Lily have shared all of this brilliant information with you. I just wanted to quickly point out some of the many benefits of it. As an individual, you're healthier and happier when you are more compassionate, when you demonstrate it to other people. It also increases this perception that you would make a good leader. So if any of you are seeking a promotion, demonstrating some compassion at work could be one of the ways to do it. In terms of thinking about relationship to other people, you have a higher quality relationship, going back to that belief in trust. Trust is more likely to emerge in relationships where compassion is practiced regularly. And I don't know if there's a lot of research on this yet, Julie, you have to let me know, but demonstrating that you care about someone else could possibly signal that you believe they matter. And mattering has deep, and like an innate human desire to feel that I matter to someone else. And compassion could be one of those ways of showing it, which also increases the relationship quality that you have with others. From an organizational standpoint, compassion is important for organizations that want to make sure people want to come to work and that they're doing their best work when they are there. So you're motivated to continue doing your work well, and it actually enhances team performance when compassion is possible. And when thinking about societal level of compassion, this was some fascinating work that Jane Dutton has done for the past like 30, 40 years, where you as a whole organization are able to scale your resources and coordinate actions when you notice suffering. And this is what happens when there's not a huge gap between the communities that these healthcare systems are embedded in. That means you are aware of what community you're in and their needs. And so you're able to build whole units that are focused on a specific health need that is disproportionately affecting people in your community. I think about the need for cancer centers in Cancer Alley in the United States. I don't know if you all are familiar with Cancer Alley, but there's this disproportionate concentration of factories that creates pollutants in the air, and the number of people that have cancers, especially cancers in younger folks, even before the age where you start screening for it. There's a need for a lot more healthcare institutions in that space, especially those who focus on oncology, right? And so that's that scaling and coordination of resources, because there's this desire to alleviate suffering that you notice is happening all around you. And it also makes me think about Julie's latest work on moral communities, which I love that phrase. But if your organization is designed to address well-being and to actually promote human life, this desire to be compassionate is a way to align what you say that you value and what you actually value. Too often we have organizations that know the things to say. It sounds good to say that we are compassionate and we care, but can you actually demonstrate how you're doing it? Are there clear examples that everyone who walks into your door can see? It's like, oh, I see that this group is compassionate. Look at what they do. Oftentimes there's a huge gap between those, and that can lead to more burnout, lead to more people not really liking their organization. So everyone wants to be compassionate, right? Because these are some great impacts to have. But in order to sustain it, again, sustaining compassion is a very effortful process, and it tends to disproportionately fall on nurses. The research that I did in preparation for this talk suggests that nurses are extremely vulnerable to compassion fatigue. It's considered a hazard of the job to be in a nursing profession in a healthcare system, that you're likely to experience this overwhelming exhaustion of your physical resources, psychological resources, cognitive resources. And then there's some that's very specific to certain units, when you're an ICU nurse, when you're a pediatric nurse, when you're an oncology nurse. Why is that the case? Why are nurses, it's just par for the course that you're going to experience compassion fatigue? What do you think is going on there? Yes.
Part of it is the values, the traits, what brings us to this profession and work also creates a vulnerability. And so it's a double-edged sword that the passion I bring, my stoicism for doing tough work turns into stoicism for not seeking care and engaging in self-care.
Interesting.
Some of the saddest.
Sadness and
You
grief.
see a lot of tragedy.
Yes.
I think in oncology in particular, it's sort of like a two-sided coin. It draws a lot of people who are people oriented and relationship focused, which is a great gift of oncology. But on the other side of the coin is that you build relationships with patients and their families, and then they die. And so I think there's a lot of grief in particular in oncology.
So high stress situations, grief is part of the work that you're doing. The people who are drawn to this work, there tends to be this, like you said, this double-edged sword between the traits that they're bringing and how that manifests in the work they do. Julie, and then here.
Well, I think it's also just the pro-social nature of people that go in, not only to nursing, but healthcare in general, where we are driven to put other people first. And as a result, and if we don't set limits there, then we lose the ability to actually prioritize our own needs.
That's interesting.
And similarly, I would just say it's an intimate relationship and we spend more time than anybody else.
That's a great point. And I agree with you that this is certainly across healthcare units. And some of the studies, this study, I think, also looks globally. And there were some cultures, especially communities that exist in collectivist cultures, where it's all about the group and less about the individual. Those nurses tend to have even higher levels of compassion fatigue because you are neglecting yourself, right? And for the greater good of everyone else. And that only works whenever there's a reciprocal caring, right? I am able to extend myself to care for you because I know that you can care for me, or there's someone else to care for me. But in our society, that notion of self-care is solely up to you as an individual. You better figure out when you're going to care for yourself because you have to get here and do the job. And again, that imagination, how can we reimagine care for the caregiver? This is part of the political agenda for this presidential election, right? What does it look like to support caregivers? And when we think about caregivers, we rarely think about healthcare providers, but you all are squarely in that as well. We're thinking about people who are staying at home with a loved one, but caregiving is it's a whole profession, and it's a life that all of us might experience, whether we care for a family member, a child, a parent. So how can we think about caring for caregivers? Because that is needed for our society. Caring has a lot of costs too. I'll go through this rather quickly because I want to get to the R&R. There's a cost to allowing compassion fatigue to persist. And this is something that if your unit doesn't think this is important, share this slide with them, right? It's gonna cost you money because you're gonna have high turnover. Traveling nurses cost way more than just retaining your own nurses, right? So you can do a better job of recruiting, retaining, and supporting the people that you have, so you're not constantly hiring new staff every year. And the biggest issue I see too, especially for a group of people who like to care for others, is that the quality of patient care goes down when compassion fatigue is high. And so it makes it that much harder to care for the next person and the next person and the next person, even though all of us need care. So this is really important for organizations to address and take seriously, that it's not just you have to figure out how to feel better because we have a job to do. We all have to figure out how to make sure you are supported and cared for, because this is going to be costly for everyone involved, especially the patients. Okay. So one of the ways that I've dealt with the cost of caring as an individual, especially as someone who, my work cares a lot about equity and systemic issues, and grief was a big part of my work. I was focusing on Black people's wellness in society, and if anyone wasn't paying attention for the last 100 years or so, it's really hard. There's a lot of pain and grief and frustration that is associated with Black culture and not Black culture, that's a space of joy, but existing as a Black person in a society that has historic and present day anti-Blackness steeped into it. So I've had to figure out a way to practice wellness for me so that I can continue to persist in that work. And two of the ways I've done this is go back to Black feminists who, again, if you listen to Black women from the first place, a lot of this imagination would not have happened. But you know, we learned from our lessons. But Audre Lorde is one of my favorite Black feminist writers. And this is where a lot of folks are starting to reimagine self-care, that it's not just an individual desire to get your nails done. We're actually trying to preserve life. And by doing so, we're pushing back against systems that suggest your life doesn't matter, or suggest that it's solely up to you to take care of yourself. No, this entire system needs to be coordinated for us to care for each other. And by caring for ourselves, we're demonstrating that. And one of the ways that we can do that is by resting and recovering. And how do you think that is? Like, how would rest and recover be like a political act? How would that demonstrate that I'm not part of this system by resting and recovering? What do you all think?
You can keep fighting.
You keep fighting, yeah, because you have the energy to do it, right? How else? I almost said a cuss word. I'm trying to do better and not cussing, maybe around. But I was like, it's a big FU, right, to the system when, as a tenure track professor, you know, there's a lot of work that's required that goes in there. A lot of it's unpaid labor, just a lot of constant work. And by saying, you know what, no, I'm gonna take a nap, that's a big FU to that system that's like, oh, you just have to keep working. It's like, or I don't. I could literally just say, no, I'm gonna take a nap today. And I'm gonna cancel that meeting. And I'm going to figure out how else I can practice joy that's not just constantly taking from me. That's a big, I'm not participating in the system in the way that you designed it. And rest and recovery is not just essential for people in tenure track roles, it's essential for anyone who's engaging in compassionate care, which again, all of us as individuals should and could practice showing compassion. I know you all read Rest is Resistance, a Manifesto from Melissa's work here with the School of Nursing. This book is groundbreaking, and it's more than just a book and a nice read. These are things you can actually put into practice in your everyday life. And one of the things that I think is essential to thinking about why rest and recovery is intimately tied to healthcare are these quotes here. It says, resting, slowing down, napping, and sleeping are not what grind culture expects of us. It will truly be a resistance as the system makes us hard and machine-like. So going back to your comment about your whole body language not being on the same page with saying, I care for you. We're hardened machines, but rest makes us tender. It makes us be able to care, and there's a lot of power in that. To come into your profession so well rested that when a patient is grieving or actually frustrating, that you're not so bothered by it because I just woke up from a glorious nap. I don't know if any of you have ever had that good nap where you wake up and you don't know what day it is and you feel so great. Now that I'm sleep deprived, mother of a newborn, when I get that rest last night, oh my God. I woke up this morning like I feel anew. So rest keeps you tender. When the inevitable grief and frustration of the job comes along, imagine how you would handle that when you're well rested. And not just that type of rest, there's multiple forms of rest. And I wanna share definitions that I've been playing around with both in my personal life and practice, but also with my research and the ways that we can imagine society. So rest, I'm drawing on it from a couple of different spaces, biology, Black feminist scholarship, et cetera. But here are some of the definitions of rest that I've come across so far. From a physics perspective, rest is an object at rest, ceasing activity, but it's also resisting any pressure to do anything, which is really hard, right? We are wired as a society, as she mentioned, from going into kindergarten, that you're not supposed to rest, right? So you have to actively resist that. It's also, according to the book, Rest is Resistance, it's an intentional practice to free yourself from capitalism and from white supremacy. And again, when I say white supremacy, I don't mean white people. I mean this ideology or belief that a certain culture is privileged and preferred and everyone should aspire to it at the expense of all other cultures and practices, right? That it's a supremacy mindset. So how can we resist that? It's by doing things like resting, by not buying something every time an ad is in front of your face, which again, advertisements don't affect people who are mindful. The more mindfulness that you practice, the less effect advertising has on you. But again, who has time for mindfulness? We're overworked and tired. I just need to go eat this burger real quick that I just saw an advertisement for, right? Instead of sitting down at home, being able to cook a meal, et cetera. The Rest is Resistance book also thinks of rest as a portal, as a way of dreaming and reimagining another way of being. So, and you ever hear the phrase, I get my best ideas in the shower or when I'm napping? You know why that is? Because your mind is free, it's wandering. And imagine, again, someone in a shower somewhere thought of health insurance. And that's, I mean, it's nowadays we're like, man, this sucks. But at the time, it was probably the most innovative idea ever, right? It's like, wow, health insurance, we should do that, right? The wheel should be round, we should do that. So if we give ourselves time to rest, we're actually able to be quite creative, not only with things in society, but even things at work. Imagine how you would approach patient care when you've had time to let your mind wander, to dream and relax. How would that change everything or anything? This is an internal medicine physician, Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith, and she has been focusing on sacred rest, and not just in the physician's profession, but she identified at least 7 different types of rest that we need. And I'm gonna share them up on the slide. And I'd like for you to think about what resting in that domain could look like. And then we'll share if there's one that comes to mind. I'm gonna take physical, so no one picks that. And that's things like taking a nap, right? But there's other forms of rest too. Now I invite you to spend some time thinking about what that could look like for you. And then if you feel not comfortable but brave, you can share it.
Okay, I'm going to just say that we did a weekly wisdom email newsletter on these. And so some of us should know some of these. Just saying, because I know
Nice,
everybody's
Valley.
so careful. But social, I know, is sometimes a combination of stepping away from people who are toxic.
Yes.
Who are not at all restful for you, but it's also being with people who energize and help you restore and recover. So there's at least 2 sides to that.
Yes.
I think for emotional, sometimes we never get rest, as you're saying, and we never unbottle what bothered you for the day. And so you just keep pressing it down, and then, it's like a shaken soda, you open it and it goes flying everywhere. I think we get to that point because we never actually let go of what happened.
Yeah.
Because we didn't rest.
Yeah. What's an emotional rest practice look
You
like?
don't allow those emotions out. So like, what is the rest? Is it suppressing it further or is it just crying?
Yeah.
'Cause I have like 4 movies I watch when I need to cry and I watch them like once a year. I spread them out.
That's a great emotional rest practice. I love that. And I
It's
think,
what you desensitize. So like once a year, like every couple months, there's one that I play and I'm like,
yes, you have to share.
Summersby is one. Ghost Dad with Bill Cosby, that one kills me, because the dad dying, it really upset me a lot. And, Legends of the Fall, that's like a lost love kind of thing, and I cannot remember the title of the other one, but we have it at home, it's a cartoon movie with the robot, Iron Giant.
Oh, Superman. That's a if you've never seen Iron Giant, oh my God, that ending. But he's alive. It got me. Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, so emotional rest is getting it out, right? And so that practice could look like journaling, therapy, everybody, therapist, right? Everyone needs a therapist, my God. Imagine if our world leaders had therapists. Oh, so getting emotions out. What's another one? Jillian.
So the sensory really
Mhm.
resonates with me, right? Because you go home and you're still hearing the monitors, you're still hearing the feeds, you're still, right? And then you get in the car and you turn on the radio, right? And there's just never a moment of stillness. That's why I think that's a really important one for me.
Good one. That's a really good one. Yes.
I'd like to say something about sensory also. a couple months ago, we went camping up in the mountains. And we practiced every day what's called a nature bath. And we would hike up way up into the mountains and find a place to sit. And then through all of the senses, be fully present. So you're looking at something, you're fully present to whatever it is you're seeing, the form, the texture and all of that. Same with hearing, what are you hearing, being fully present. It's just a very, very calming, you go through all the senses. It's just very, very calming and relaxing and restful exercise.
It's wonderful. I encourage all of you to think about at least one form of these rests that you can put in place today. Mine is gonna be a nap. This is my last little bit of time before I'm back with baby. So I'm gonna take a nap on the train on the way home. But think about at least one form of rest that you can put into practice today. And I want to distinguish rest from recovery. We often say them both together casually, like, oh, R&R, I need some R&R. But recovery is actually quite different from rest. Whereas rest is ceasing activity, recovery is actually engaging in an activity. But it's an activity that restores you, that renews you, that allows you to come back into your work even better than you left it, right? And so I think about this from an exercise standpoint where you have those active recovery days. So there's exercising and then there's not exercising, but in between there's stretching, right? There's things that keep your body moving, but they're not exerting you to the point of exhaustion. So when I think about recovery, it's all about adjusting how it is that you're interacting with others, yourself, even adjusting how it is that you're breathing so that you're able to go into work. I know like there's been some mindfulness training here, but being able to practice breath work before going into a very difficult healthcare setting or even your class and teaching. I would invite my students at the beginning of classes to start breathing, right? Especially when I know we're gonna have a difficult conversation. And that shifts the whole dynamic in the room when everyone is taking a collective deep breath instead of, oh no, we're saying something uncomfortable. Oh no, I'm not exhaling. Oh no, now I'm gonna, right? It's like, now I'm anxious. It's like, can you like slowly let all of that out? I also went through Lamaze, right? So I'm breathing a lot better. And one of the things I love about recovery, going back to what I was saying earlier about the trauma or the suffering being so overwhelming, it allows us to disconnect without disassociating, right? And so I'm able to keep moving my body from an exercise standpoint, but not so much that I'm not moving my body at all. I think when we're doing equity work, sometimes I just want to tune everything out. Can I just pretend that people love Black people and not just Black culture? Can I just pretend that as a woman, I actually have rights over my own body? Can I just pretend for a little bit and escape? Just like I don't have to escape. I can have moments of joy where I'm listening to my favorite jams and dancing with people in the street. I can have moments of joy where I'm celebrating being a woman. That lactation room you all have downstairs is the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen. Right? And I felt so privileged to be able to be in that space, even when I'm existing in a society that's trying to regulate my body, right, without my voice. So when I think about recovery activities, this book is what came to mind. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown. Adrienne Maree Brown is one of the clearest thinkers of our generation. You would love her writing and her memes. But her book that she helped to edit, it's all about doing what Tony K. Zamora calls, you have to make the resistance irresistible. As we're working to change healthcare systems, as we're working to address inequity, we have to make it a pleasurable experience. Otherwise, we won't do it, right? It's too hard. It's too hard to try to change things. So I'll just stick with the status quo, even though that's creating that self-fulfilling prophecy. My work sucks, but there's nothing I can do about it, so it still sucks, right? It's like, how can we make work better? It's going to be challenging, but what is it that we need to do to make it feel good? The activities that we're trying to make better. This is one of my favorite quotes from her book, when she's talking about living and surviving under racial capitalism, white supremacy, ableist society, et cetera. She said the truest victory is our healing, our longevity, our continuation, our joy. That is another big F you to a system, right? To say, I'm going to smile through it. And not a forced smile, right? A very genuine one. So that which brings you joy is what's going to help you recover. Anyone have an idea of what brings them joy? This is going to be a good journal prompt. Asking yourself, what brings me joy? And how can you integrate that into everyday life? Something that brings me joy is Irish Springs soap. Anyone familiar with Irish Springs? Know why that brings me joy? Because it reminds me of my grandma. And my grandma's dead. She's been dead for 20 years. And it's tearing up, but I remember the memories too, right? So it's like, there's that grief, there's that joy. And I don't use Irish Spring Spoke, but I keep it in my bathroom because I want to smell it. I want to be reminded of all those memories I have with her. That brings me joy to have that around, to make sure I continue to buy my grandpa Irish Springs as he celebrates his 90th birthday next year, right? Like Irish Springs. So that which brings you joy, that's just gonna help you recover and bounce back. Really quickly, so a more racially just and equitable healthcare system is possible, going back to embracing those possibilities. And this is a study done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They asked a bunch of different communities that have been marginalized and maligned by the healthcare system, what type of system they'd like to exist in instead. And this is some of the dreams that they came up with. And some of them are quite practical, where everyone is really listened to and treated with dignity. That's doable. We can do that, right? Everyone feels cared for and they have the tools to make sure that I have the best possible experience, where people who work in the healthcare system are grounded in community. What does that mean to be grounded in community? Does that mean that some of your healthcare days are spent in the community, not just always providing care, but sometimes being cared for or connecting with people who live there? It's accessible, it's affordable, it's free, it's easy to use. How can we bring their imagination to life? And some of that means that we're embracing things that are emergent. And emergent things it doesn't always feel good because it's new and it's scary. And what if it doesn't work? But allow things to emerge, ground ourselves in love, assume that we all have these best intentions, and assume that there's an abundance of resources. We almost always start with a deficit. Well, we can't because we don't and we can't. There's just so little. But imagine if everyone had time to listen. Listening is free. We don't have to worry about the costs of listening, but we can do it more, right? And the last thing with her quotes is, again, rest and resistance is important for bringing an imagination of that type of healthcare system to life, because it allows us to step outside of this culture where we have brainwashed ourselves that we don't know how to rest. Someone mentioned this earlier where they said they really struggled with rest as resistance because they don't know how to rest, or they felt guilty for resting. I feel that all the time. I take a nap and I'm like, there's so many other things I could be doing. I could be helping to save the world, but I need to take a nap, right? So how do I do both? And according to her, we don't have to think of it as either or. Resting is the work, right? Doing things that bring you joy is the work of healthcare. And it helps us to break free of the shackles of grind culture. So creating a strategy for rest and recovery, again, it's more than just you as an individual. This is something that a whole organization can embrace. And I had some ideas on how this healthcare system could do it. But of course, these are just my ideas. I'm just one person. There's more that's out there. But here are just some ideas you can take back with you to your different units and departments. One is creating accountability for things like wellness goals. So oftentimes the numbers that organizations like to share is we serve this many patients. We save this much money. We are this efficient with how we meet with patients. But what if it's things like our staff sleeps on average 8 hours a night? What if that's your wellness goal? That everyone at the end of the year has an average sleep score of 8 hours. How can you be accountable to a goal like that, right? Or your wellness goals are things that you are transparent about. Your quality of life. Those are the scores that are tied to things like funding for a healthcare institution. So imagine if the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation would say, your hospital can earn this grant if your staff quality of life scores are above this threshold. Now, all of a sudden, all hospitals care about how well you're sleeping at night, right? They all care about your staffing because their goals and some accountability is tied to your well-being. And we have to be transparent about whatever changes we are putting in place that are designed to help your well-being. Often we'll say, well, we had Dr. McCluney out there, she talked about R&R check, and we're done. But was there any follow-up? Did we know if this resonated with folks? Did we put it into practice? Are we able to see tangible outcomes? And if not, what are we going to do differently? And how can we communicate that with people we're involved with? The other is to measure rest and recovery practices. And I think about this at more at the unit level. Can we create rest and recovery competencies for leaders that we're actually evaluating them on? And those could be things like not just saying, are you well rested, but how can I make room for you to rest during your shift today? How can I address your unmet needs? What emotions are you bottling up? What would it look like to get that out? Do we need to have a therapist on staff? Right? Like those are some of the ways you can measure that. I often think about this with corporations too. There's a lot of unused vacation time that people have. The US is one of the countries that has the most vacation days and the least amount of people use them. And part of why they don't use them is because their leaders aren't using them. So they believe that there's a modeling effect going on where if I don't see it modeled, I don't think I should do it either. So leaders need to do it, and there needs to be intervention when you notice there's a unit where people haven't been taking time off. Often we only come to units when we see an issue, but come to it when you see, hey, you all have a lot of unused vacation time. What's going on? I don't feel like I can step away. Well, why? Right? We get really curious. Well, what's going on here? Why can't you step away? Do we need to hire more people? Do we need to redistribute some of the workload? You all need to take time off. And let's measure that so we can intervene before it's too late. And then in shifts, what would it look like to have an abundance of people on staff so that everyone can take a break? And not just a break after, man, that was a long code. Now you should take a break. Take a break on a slow day. Take a break every day, right? Like what would that look like if that's the type of work that we're doing? And then the very last thing, how can we have opportunities for people to work in a flow state? Dr. Martin Seligman at UPenn, who studies positive psychology, is like a positive psychology guru. He talks about working in flow, where you become so immersed in an activity that seems like time is just going by. And in nursing, but all healthcare professions, there's a lot of routines, things that you do over and over again, like washing your hands. What would it look like if washing your hands became a flow activity? Does there need to be music playing? Is there a meditation that you're doing? What can make something as simple as washing your hands an opportunity for you to relax and to be in a bit of a flow state before you jump into the next thing? These are all different ways that you can start to integrate a rest and recovery strategy at your work. And as I said before, that helps you with addressing a lot of cost. So the way I end all my presentations by asking these 3 questions for people to take with them. What are you sitting with? Something that you heard today that you want to spend more time pondering or thinking about, even if you disagree with it, it's like getting curious about why, like, what are you sitting with? What do you want to share with someone else? Like, I heard this today and I'm going to share this with my friend, with my parent, with my spouse. What do you want to share with others? And then what will you put into practice? I hope a lot of you go and take a nap. But if that's not possible, what else could you put into practice? And we have 5 minutes, yes, for Q&A. And I'll leave this up here, right? Hannah, you want to, okay.
Yes.
I'll leave this up here while we do a quick Q&A. And I love you guys so much, love in a very, high level sense, and let me not be disingenuous. But I'd love to hear your question, not your life story, if you have a question. So that's one of the ways that we can make it more Q&A. Or there's no questions and everyone wants to take this 5 minutes, take a nap. You can do that too. Yes.
I've been in here for 40 years, and I love that finally we're addressing this. And I've worked in cancer the entire 40 years next year. But it's like they say the nice things, not put in practice. And how you just get frustrated. And how the justice system.
That's a good question. I think there has to be accountability, right? And in the capitalist system, we have to tie it to money. Right? I think that point was a good one, that money talks. And we need more people in leadership who believe that these things should be put into practice. Some ways. Did you have your answer?
Well, I think I know the answer, but I'll go ahead. Where does that sense of it never ends fit? I think the answer is in our imagination that it can get there.
Yeah. I mean, from a Buddhist philosophy, suffering is life, right? Trying to have a life void of suffering is to not live. Because then you're pretending like it doesn't exist and you're disassociating completely and not allowing yourself to notice it. But that's not real living. So what do we want to end? If we want things like inequity to end, we could work towards that. But suffering will not end, sadly. But that means that there's even more room for compassion, right? If suffering is something that's part of life. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Piggybacking on saying all the right things.
sometimes there's a lot of talking a good game about equity, but when a patient comes into the hospital, we don't even have diverse appropriate hair care products. We cannot meet your basic physical.
Wow.
Yeah, right? But there's a lot of.
And those tangible examples, that's what matters, right? I think again, our imagination about equity is so big, making something bigger than what it is, that stops us in our tracks. And I'm trying really hard, even in my speech, to like not use a lot of ableist language, like turning a blind eye, being paralyzed by fear. We're not using that, right? So that's why I just did this. And I was like, noticing. I have to take a second to think about what I'm trying to say, because we're so casual with our inequity that it seeps in our language, it seeps in the hair products we buy, right? So part of that noticing how to care and be concerned is noticing not just that you exist and you are a patient and you have a need, but you exist in this body, in this gender, in this race, right? This is part of your lived experiences. And how can I notice all of that and be able to care for all of who you are? Not just, well, I'm gonna assume you're just like everyone else and treat you as such. Yeah, that's a big part. And that's a very simple thing that could be addressed. Yeah. I will say this too, as a final point, as Lily comes up, do not be overwhelmed by the state of suffering. Tap into your joy, hope, and faith as tools that can prepare you to act. And it starts all with taking a nap. So with that.
Thank you so much. Love this woman's energy, brilliance, imagination, and yeah. So just one quick thing, there is a new process for CEs. In the past, you could have 30 days. Not so anymore. Now it's only 12 days. So take a picture of this for your reference and maybe put this on your to-do list for sometime maybe next week. And thank you again for coming. We love having you all, and I love seeing people here from Sentara, or across the street, as we say. It's wonderful, wonderful to see you.
Thank you, Lil.
Thank you.